Boa tarde, moitas grazas por vir. Imos dar comezo a este acto, se vos parece. Boa tarde a todas e todos. É unha honra para min. As primeiras verbas as dirixo en galego e despois imos a falar todo o acto en inglés. Hai un servizo de traducción simultánea para quen quera escoitar a traducción e despois, cando queirades participar facendo alguna pregunta ao final, podedes facerlo en español ou en galego e a profesora Nussbaum recibirá a traducción e vos contestará en inglés e vos poderedes seguir a traducción ao través do servizo de traducción simultánea. É unha honra para min, como decano da Facultade de Filosofía, dar a benvida á profesora Martha Nussbaum, recén investida doutora honoris causa por esta universidade. Grazas, profesora Nussbaum, por ter aceptado participar con nós neste acto. Acompáñame nesta conversa coa profesora Nussbaum os profesores da USC Laura Lojo, da Facultade de Filoloxía, Pedro López Barja, da Facultade de Xeografía e Historia, Jesús Ángel Sánchez García, que tamén é da Facultade de Xeografía e Historia, José Francisco Meiriños, da Universidade do Porto, a Facultade de Filosofía. Moitas grazas, profesor Meiriños, por estar aquí connosco tamén. Iba a participar o profesor Óscar Horta, pero puxose enfermo, non pudo asistir. Pasoume as preguntas, así que eu podo formular as preguntas que me formulou e que despois a profesora Nussbaum poderá contestar. Esta conversa coa profesora Nussbaum, na que ao final da mesma os asistentes terán a oportunidade de facerlle tamén as preguntas que estimen oportunas, está organizada en gran parte por esta Facultade de Filosofía, pero tamén por unha agrupación de grupos de investigación en humanidades que chamase o Pais das Humanidades, e que será o xermo do futoiro Instituto de Investigación en Humanidades desta universidade, ao cal poderán no futuro ascribirse as persoas que así o desexen. Benvidos a todos e todas, entón vou a pasar ao inglés e a partir de aquí, a quen quera seguir este evento co servicio de traducción simultánea, pois poderá seguirlo. A intervención, primeiro comenzarei eu, despois terá a palabra o profesor José Francisco Meiriños, despois interverá a profesora Lojo, despois Pedro López Barja, Jesús Sánchez García, despois Pedro López Barja, e ao final eu formularei no seu nome as preguntas do profesor Óscar Horta. Ben, it's with great pleasure that we gather here today to honor Dr. Nussbaum and to acknowledge her kindness in accepting the honorary doctorate awarded by the University of Santiago de Compostela. As the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy, I am especially honored and grateful to Dr. Nussbaum for accepting our invitation to visit our faculty, to share her thoughts with us, engaging in a conversation with professors, researchers, and students, all of them equally inspired and appealed by her thought and academic imprint. Having Dr. Nussbaum here with us today could not have been possible without the financial aid, support, and enthusiasm of different people and institutions whose efforts I would like here to acknowledge. Thanks are due to the University of Santiago de Compostela, to the Faculty of Philosophy's former dean, my predecessor, Professor Marcelino Agis Villaverde, who was the initial promoter of Dr. Nussbaum's candidacy, and of course to Dr. Nussbaum's godfather, Dr. Martín González Fernández, without whose painstaking work and academic commitment this could not have been possible. I also want to thank Dr. José Francisco Meiriñas from the University of Porto, Department of Philosophy, who has been appointed to act as Professor Nussbaum's academic sponsor by Dr. Martín González Fernández. I would also like to acknowledge the financial aid, personal commitment, and academic enthusiasm of 3 research groups: Discourse and Identity from the Faculty of Philology, AIDU from the Department of History of Art, and Syncrasies from the Faculty of Geography and History, represented here today by 3 principal investigators, Laura Lojo, Jesús Ángel Sánchez, and Pedro López Baraja. It's not a coincidence that these 3 groups are present here to share their thoughts with Dr. Nussbaum in conversation. These groups and their researchers, along with other groups from the humanities and social sciences, have painstakingly worked to promote bonds of collaboration across disciplines and research fields in a transdisciplinary approach, firmly believing that the humanities and social sciences are called to address urgent global challenges of our contemporary society. This collaborative project has been eventually institutionalized in the forthcoming creation of the first Humanities Institute in Galicia and in the Spanish nation-state. In this sense, the Institute for the Humanities and its aims perfectly align with Dr. Nussbaum's work over the years and with her commitment to actively engaging with social and political issues. Dr. Nussbaum's work has been an inspiration for all of us. I would also like to mention some people from our faculty that have introduced aspects of Dr. Nussbaum's work on their reading lists and discussed her work in their lectures. To begin with, Professor Luis García Soto teaches courses on ethics and philosophy and education, in whose programs Dr. Nussbaum's texts and ideas play a crucial role. Yolanda Martínez Suárez, Alberto Franco Barrera, and Guadalupe Jiménez Esquinas teach courses on political philosophy, citizenship, justice and democracy, and anthropology and philosophy of gender, respectively, in which Dr. Nussbaum's ideas are explicitly treated and also play an important role. Maria Jesús Vázquez Lobeiras has also been interested in Dr. Nussbaum's ideas on cosmopolitanism, and Oscar Horta has found in Dr. Nussbaum's work a great inspiration to develop his own work on animal ethics. I don't want to forget the work of Maria José Agra, a retired professor of our department, whose interest and commitment with Dr. Nussbaum's work and ideas has been also notorious. Last but not least, our faculty decided to name one of our seminar rooms in the first floor of this building in honor of Martha Nussbaum. Dr. Nussbaum, one of the most prominent philosophers in the world, has addressed a variety of topics from a philosophical and humanist perspective, ranging from ancient Greek and Roman philosophy to political philosophy, existentialism, feminism, ethics, including animal rights, precisely the subject of her honorary doctor's speech today. Her work has been widely recognized by the academia and by society in general. As her many prizes and awards attest, among them, Nussbaum was awarded with the Príncipe de Asturias Prize for the Social Sciences. Her numerous publications include The Fragility of Goodness, Cultivating Humanity, a classical defense of reforming liberal education, sex and social justice, Frontiers of Justice, Disability, Nationality, Species Membership, From Disgust to Humanity, Sexual Orientation and Constitutional Law, Upheavals of Thought, her well-known book on emotions, and recently her most recent book, Justice for Animals, Our Collective Responsibility. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Nussbaum. We are deeply grateful for having accepted our humble invitation and are most honored to have you with us here today. The researchers who accompany us today have some questions to ask you, addressing different issues that tackle in various ways and from different disciplines your long academic career. After our conversation, members of the audience are most welcome to make their own questions and comments. This will be a crucial part in this event, as I am sure that the audience is very interested in asking about a variety of issues that you have addressed in your wide-ranging work. Let me begin by asking you a question about the first of your texts that I remember reading. As an earlier student of the degree in philosophy, I was captivated by one of your articles on Heraclitus' concept of soul, an article published at Phronesis in 1972, in which you compare Heraclitus' ideas with the Homeric tradition. I was deeply impressed by your scholarly and deep analysis of Heraclitus' notion of psyche. But in the present time, when I come back to this text and put it in the context of your ideas developed later, I think that this analysis must have set a trend in your subsequent work, as I have lately read in a recent contribution by Sine Mirbo. In some way, Heraclitus is the first psychologist and clearly breaks up with established Greek tradition, highlighting the role of the soul as a cognitive and linguistic faculty. How important is Heraclitus' thought and your own reading of him in your subsequent philosophical work?
Okay, I think I have to use that. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming here and to say how grateful I am to accept the honor of this honorary doctorate from this wonderful, distinguished university. And I want to thank Professor Donato for organizing this event. I think it's wonderful that he's done this, and I'm very happy to respond to all the questions. I'm delighted that you mentioned that old article. You know, it was the very first article I ever published, and I was a first-year graduate student. I had just arrived at Harvard. It was the spring semester, the first seminar I had ever taken in ancient Greek philosophy, and this was my term paper. And then Will Owen, who was teaching the seminar, said he thought that it might be published, and so he sent it off to David Furley at Phronesis, and with revisions, it was published. You know, so I didn't know. I was just writing a term paper. What was I doing? I didn't think it set a trend, of course, at all. But I think, you know, now that you ask that question, I suppose there's a certain, I mean, first of all, of course, the devotion to precision and getting the text right and really digging deeply into the history of a text. That's something I've always tried to do whenever I do work on ancient texts, and I really admire when anyone else does it well. But I think there's a certain idea of looking for the unity in diverse phenomena and looking at what brings the whole thing together that has persisted in my work on the emotions. That's really what I'm doing, is looking for a theory that we start with very concrete phenomena. And that's why I open upheavals of thought with a very particular emotional experience of grief, but then to back up and look at the unity in that diversity. So I guess I would say, if that's a trend, maybe that was the trend that article started. But I want to say also that it really exemplifies the importance of a teacher who was able to encourage a young woman who was, you know, there weren't very many women in philosophy. There was no tenured woman in the Harvard philosophy department at that time or for many years after that. And, you know, the professor, he wasn't the perfect professor, but he did encourage me to publish that article. And I think that is something that should be mentioned.
Okay. Thank you. I have asked about one of your earlier texts. My second question concerns one of your last books, namely Citadels of Pride. In this work, you show how the emotion of pride lies at the basis of sexual abuse and harassment and other forms of exploitation and abuse. But your examples in the book are mostly related to individual cases. Do you think that pride can have a more public role as an underlying trait of our species? It seems that pride can also be manifested as an attitude of arrogance and overbearingness of our species against the environment and other living creatures. What do you think about this, and how could this phenomenon be reversed?
Okay. Now, first of all, let me just clarify something that some people have misunderstood. By pride, I do not mean the way pride is used in, like, the gay pride movement, that is to say, a self-confident self-assertion. I'm talking about the vice of pride in Dante and the way it's used in the whole Catholic tradition, namely as a particular attitude of setting yourself above others, thinking that you're better than others and that they hardly exist at all. And so it's that I'm exploring. Well, you know, I'm a little surprised that you think it's all particular and not general, because I think of this as a very law-focused book. It's really all about the institutions that we need to get on top of human vice. Now, of course, there is a tendency in all human beings, and I think here the Catholic tradition is quite right, that we all have tendencies to narcissism, if you will, or to thinking that we are real and others are not real, and so on. And I think it has been particularly dangerously encouraged in the upbringing of many, many men in many, many cultures who grow to think that women are just objects for their manipulation and use. So that's a tendency that's general. But how can we repress it? Well, of course, parents bringing up children have to do a lot, but I'm not an educator of small children. And I am a professor of law, as I've happened to become late in life. And I do think that law has a tremendous role to play in curbing and deterring these bad tendencies. If you think about sexual harassment, which is one of the main topics of the book, before there were laws and policies against sexual harassment, it was everywhere. I mean, the same professor I just praised, he was a great sexual harasser, and he harassed everyone. And he was an equal opportunity harasser, so, you know, no one suffered more than anyone else, but we all suffered. And so I have to say that when there were policies and people knew that they could be disciplined or even dismissed from the university because of sexual harassment, this had a huge deterrent value. Today, I haven't seen in my department or any department I know an instance of sexual harassment. And that's not because people have become better. I think in personal relationships you still see a lot of pride, but it's because of deterrence, and that's law. So what I was doing in the book was to say, where do we see bad overgrowths of pride? And these are places where the institutional and legal culture is weak. So the three that I explored in detail were the world of the performing arts, where, of course, artists are very badly protected in their employment because employment contracts are usually like gig contracts, and therefore you're not covered by any union, and so I explored that world that made people unusually dependent on the vices of a Harvey Weinstein or a Bill Cosby. And then I explored the world of the federal judiciary in the U.S., where judges could get away with harassing women who were their clerks for years and years and years, because the clerks were bound by a vow of silence. They couldn't say anything even years later. And there were no rules about whistleblowing that protected them if they did come forward. So that was the second one. The third was the world of, fortunately you don't have this here, college sports. Now that world is a terribly corrupt world, because unlike professional sports where there are players' unions and there's a negotiated contract that contains issues about harassment or domestic violence, and players have been disciplined in quite a number of serious cases, instead, the colleges are kind of run by these for-profit investment companies that want TV contracts, and they have a stake in making sure that the players play, whether they have harassed women or not. Now, I'm glad to say that only a few years after the book, that world is already crumbling. All of a sudden, even the toothless NCAA, that's the national association that's supposed to police all this, has suddenly said players should be paid and they should have a regular employment state. So then, of course, law comes right in the minute that happens. What I wanted to say is where the institutional culture is weak or non-existent, then pride runs rampant. It's not that men in those areas are worse than men in let's say, the law firm world or the business world. It's just that they have weak institutions. What is the remedy, you ask? Well, of course, as I say, good parents know a lot of ways to do that. But I think in general, what we have to think about is what Dante nicely brings out with his good story in the account of Pride and Purgatory, namely the ability to listen to the voices of others. The Emperor Trajan listened to the voice of the poor woman who wanted his help. And so he's the good example that all the proud people have to mimic when they're unlearning their vice. And I think we've come some way toward this in listening to the voices of women in our academic culture and our culture more generally. Okay.
Thank you very much. Now it's the turn of our visitor from the University of Porto, Professor José Francisco Meiriñas. Thank you for visiting us in this occasion.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor De Donato, for giving me the opportunity to ask Professor Martha Nussbaum a question and participate in this debate. Before that, and on behalf of the Institute of Philosophy of the University of Porto and the Portuguese Society of Philosophy, I would like to convey our compliments and thanks to the Faculty of Philosophy of the University of Santiago de Compostela for having promoted this just tribute to Professor Nussbaum for the reasons that Professor Martin Gonzalez so well underlined in his speech this morning. It is an honor for me to have been appointed by Professor Martin Gonzalez, replacing him in this session. On his behalf, I would love to imagine an engaged Iberian philosophical agreement in this well-deserved tribute to Professor Nussbaum. So my question begins this way. In your extensive and remarkable work, Professor Nussbaum, you contributed to philosophy in so many areas that choosing when to continue this dialogue is a very difficult task. Your contribution to studying classical Greek philosophy, the tragedians, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and so on, is profound and comprehensive in many ways. In works just quoted and others that are worth mentioning too, like the study and translation of Aristotle's De Motu Animalium, The Fragility of Goodness, Cultivating Humanity, Plato's Republic, The Good Society and the Formation of Desire, you challenged conventional interpretations of emotions, virtues, desire, freedom, democracy, and political regimes, the certainties of human existence, practical wisdom, while allowing yourself to be influenced by the Greek philosophical traditions, as you have just remembered. Regarding this seminal part of your work, I'd like to ask you a question, in fact, split in two, both related in so many ways to the first question raised by Professor Javier De Donato. The first one relates to the proliferation of hate speech, spreading false information, and growing appeal for authoritarian and rude leaders worldwide. In our increasingly polarized world, what lessons can we still learn from Greek philosophy to promote truthful public discourse and civic engagement?
Well, you know, I think that there's no better example of how to help people learn how to proceed in a dialogue with respect for others than to study Socrates and the tradition of the early Platonic dialogues. I mean, years after years of teaching, and I find that those texts, I could pick many other texts, but those dialogues, partly because of Plato's great literary skill, but partly just because of the sheer quality of the philosophy that's going on there, students really get hooked in, and they really want to study philosophy. I remember when I was writing my book on education, I was talking to a young guy who was working behind the desk in my gym, and he was reading the Apology and Crito. And I said, oh, well, why are you reading the Apology and Crito? And he described, this was a young business student at a college only for business, not for any liberal arts or anything. But they did have some liberal arts requirements. And he had been asked to study Socrates. And he got fascinated by the life and behavior of Socrates. And he said that this man who asking questions and asking you to ask questions about yourself, and that really hooked him in. And obviously he had not had much confidence in his own intelligence or his not much command. And suddenly this gave him the idea that he could explore himself and lead the examined life. And now I'll jump forward to a pre-publication thing. I've just had an article accepted by the Chronicle of Higher Education, which will come out in January, about this very thing. I was visiting a program at the Utah Valley University, which is a state university in the state of Utah, has 45,000 students, no entrance requirements. So the students are not well prepared. They just want a college degree. They just walk in there. And every single one of them, all 45,000, are required to take a philosophy class that starts with Socrates. And this is a very rare thing, and it's an amazing thing. So I was asked to lecture there, and I came and I gave my lecture. But what I saw was two packed rooms full of students who were so excited by the activity of Socratic reasoning that they were really had a different attitude to themselves. And I think that's what I would like philosophy to foster in undergraduate education, no matter how you would do it. But when you can teach Socrates and teach it well, it has that catalytic effect. I don't think it had to be a Greek. And frankly, in my own department, I'm not a particular fan that we must have more and more Greek philosophy. In fact, I always forbid my colleagues to use the word ancient philosophy, because that suggests you are thinking it's only ancient Greek and Roman philosophy that's ancient philosophy, whereas I think ancient Indian philosophy is worth studying, ancient Chinese philosophy is worth studying, and actually next quarter I'm teaching Indian political and legal thought. I'm not teaching the Greeks at all. But I think it happens to be the case that the Socratic dialogues have this amazing effect. And whatever the text you use, you'd better try to have that effect. Now, why were the students studying philosophy? Not because they were going to be philosophy majors. Almost none of them would be. Maybe, 10 out of that 500 in the room would be philosophy majors. But I think there are three things they get. And one is what you referred to. In a culture of polarization and hate speech, they suddenly learn how to carry on a respectful dialogue with other people who disagree with them. And they did this with me. I mean, I was talking about animal rights in Utah, where everyone loves hunting. And this was a very controversial topic. I got very tough questions, and they were not afraid to give me tough questions. So they had that confidence because they had examined themselves and they had learned to respect others. And so this is what I think a well-taught undergraduate course in philosophy can offer. At my own university, there's a colleague of mine, Agnes Callard, who teaches, started a thing called the Night Owls. And this is where students come in at midnight to talk philosophy about some topic. And she gets, a cool topic, like she'll talk about divorce or something like that. But it will be done in a Socratic philosophical way. And, you get 250 people coming at midnight to talk about philosophy. I don't go because I go to sleep early and I get up super early. I have different hours from Agnes. But anyway, that somebody has the hours of the undergraduate is really important. So, I think this is what we want. Now, how do we get it? There are many different ways to get that effect, but I do think that the example of Socrates is a great one. Now, more generally, I do think that the Greeks and the Romans, you left out the Romans, and the Romans are my great friends these days, because when I do teach ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, it's usually the Romans, Cicero and Seneca, because in our program, we have a lot of people who do Greek philosophy, and I'm the only one who does the Hellenistic period, where the most interesting texts are Roman. I love Cicero and I love Seneca. But anyhow, the fact is, I think that we get a lot of things from these texts that are really, really valuable. I think the origins of emotion theory that I find interesting are in the Stoics. I think that the Epicureans have wonderful ideas about freedom. The origin of the determinism, non-determinism debate is right there in the Hellenistic world. But other things too, like Cicero's little works on friendship and on aging. Now think about the whole topic of aging. We're all going through it, and I more than most of the people in this room. But what does philosophy say about that? Cicero's De Senectute is the best thing that philosophy has to offer on that topic. And I can only think of one other thing, and that's Simone de Beauvoir's La Vieillesse, and I happen not to think that that's her best work. But Cicero's dialogue is great. So there's so many things in that tradition that I love and value that I'm very happy to spend more time with it.
Thank you very much. Now it's turn of the Professor Laura Lojo from the Faculty of Philology.
Moitas grazas, señor decano. Grazas ao grupo, gracias por darlle ao grupo de investigación Discurso e Identidade a oportunidade de estar aquí hoxe presente. So thank you so much, Dr. Nussbaum, for being able to join us today in this conversation. I am no philosopher myself, but I find particularly appealing and sort of fascinating about your work is the way you approach a broad transdisciplinary audience. And without actually undermining the philosophical thought and weight of your work. You're able to do that probably because your idea is to bring philosophy to the fore at the very center of political and social debates. Probably that's one of the things. And probably because you think, and that's one of the basic ideas in your work that I find also particularly fascinating, how philosophy is actually called on to address major political and global challenges in general. Things that have to do with exclusion, poverty, global justice in general. And normally what you argue is that philosophy actually does that by sort of systematizing or theorizing about general emotions that all men and women can actually, feel about, and philosophy sort of systematizes or sort of theorizes and puts together the kind of common basic ideas that we all sort of share. So that's something that I particularly enjoy about your work. My question has to do with probably one of your most sort of seminal, if you like, books, which is entitled Women and Human Development, The Capabilities Approach, that was published in the year 2000. And this is just one curiosity. The book is actually dedicated to another woman that was, very influential in your life. That is your former mother-in-law, Sarah Nussbaum, who was born in Galicia, but not the sort of Spanish Galicia. I thought it was that at the beginning. I was, just, freaking out. But then eventually realized it was somewhere else. But she was actually a sort of the relevance of role model for other women to follow in a way. I mean, she was Weizmann's student, and she was present when Moritz Lick actually was murdered. The founder. Maybe you can tell us about that later. But that's something that I find particularly fascinating. Now, my question is a more theoretical kind of approach and has to do with gender, since I'm sort of a professor of gender studies. And in that book that I mentioned, you unfold the capabilities approach that you understand as a sort of what people are able to do and to be given a particular threshold. From the principle, or sort of beginning with the idea or the principle that every person should be conceived of as an end basically. And as such, you argue that certain universal norms of human capability should be central for political purposes in general, in thinking about, for example, political principles that should be backbone of a set of constitutional guarantees of all nations. And in a way, your feminist agenda aims to apply the capabilities approach, if I understand it correctly, to foster women's empowerment and development, but across nations and across cultures. It is a sort of viable universalist feminism that is committed to cross-cultural norms of justice, equality and rights, but at the same time, it is sensitive to particularity. It can't be otherwise. It is attentive to how circumstances shape preferences and beliefs. So other feminist approaches seem to you, well, sometimes pessimistic, not being clear about real options for women or gender in general, especially the kind of feminism that you label as the symbolic type. So could you tell us, your position, the advantages of your own capabilities approach over other feminists?
Well, thank you so much for that very rich question. Yes, before I forget it, yes, Sarah Nussbaum was born in this shtetl on the border of Poland and the Ukraine. And so here was this woman born in a shtetl with parents who were barely literate. But they saw they had a very bright daughter, and they had the courage to pick up and move to Vienna, and where he got a job as the caretaker in a synagogue and so forth. And so she was a student at the University of Vienna at the time you mentioned. Yeah, a very brilliant woman. So I was very, very moved by her whole life. But okay, so my feminism, I think, is in all my writing, not just in the capabilities approach. And I would say, roughly speaking, my writing is in two main areas: the emotions and normative political philosophy, the capabilities. And of course, they intersect a lot. And I think at the heart of both is recognition of both the vulnerability of human beings, the importance of protecting that, but also the importance of cultivating some good forms of vulnerability, such as love and care. So all of that, of course, bleeds into both of those areas. Now, I think some forms of feminism, it's just the bad writing, quite frankly. I think there's bad writing all over philosophy. I think in analytic philosophy, there's a lot of bad writing, and in continental philosophy, too. My students, my graduate students, often don't really write very well. And it's getting worse because people are reading literature less and using computers more and so on. So I feel that's a real problem, because if you're going to communicate as a philosopher to people on issues of importance, you have to do it in a way that touches them in some way. And so that's why in Women in Human Development, I tell a lot of stories about actual women, especially because they're in India. I chose to write about India because that's where our project had done a lot of its basic field work, and so I knew a lot about it. I didn't want to bring in one example from China and one example from Iran in the way that some feminists do. So I had to give them a sense of what it is like to live in that context, what it's like to struggle for your education and so forth. But I think more generally, in all my writing, I try to give examples, even writing about the survival of whales. There's the most recent article that I published in the New York Review of Books anniversary issue. I ended up giving, at the end, the story of our family excursion to a place where orcas swim, where we scattered the ashes of my dear departed daughter, because I knew that that would make people interested in the plight of the orcas. Actually, they might not be interested in orcas at all, but because they were interested in my story, they might become interested in the plight of the orcas, as my daughter was passionately involved with that. So, you have to think what is going to actually move the reader. And in the beginning of most of my books, or even chapters of books, I have concrete examples, and I try to write them well. Upheavals of Thought begins with a narrative of my mother's death. Now, it doesn't matter whether it was actually true. I'm not a good enough fiction writer that I can actually make up things, so I usually do have a basis in reality. But I always caution reporters, don't say that this is what actually happened. My model is Seneca, who often learned how to do that. He learned how to use examples really well to hook his audience into the project of philosophy. So I think that's what good philosophy needs to do, but feminist philosophy more than ever, because people have to have a sense of what it's all about. What are the real problems? I think the writing of my friend Catherine McKinnon does that brilliantly. She really listens to women, and she has a almost pathologically acute sense of other people's suffering, and she knows how to translate that into words. And actually, her book about the pornography ordinances that she and Andrea Dworkin sponsored, it's called In Harm's Way, contains transcripts of the actual hearings where women give their testimony of sexual abuse and so forth. So I think this leads me also to talk about law, because the way the common law tradition, which I'm a part of in the US system, proceeds is precisely like that. They're the particular cases, and then you get from that a general norm, which is provisional, and then new cases will refine and further specify the norm. So you're always going up and down, as it were, from particular to general and back again. And that's, I guess, why I fit so comfortably, my own methodology fits so comfortably in the common law legal tradition. Now, I think the symbolic type of feminism has some contributions to make, but the trouble is that it's written in a way that doesn't communicate very well to the general public. I think that's true of actually a lot of continental philosophy. I remember when I first gave a paper in a seminar of Jürgen Habermas, he seemed very puzzled because it was part of Women in Human Development. It had so many examples in it, and he said, well, I suppose Kant would classify this as anthropology. Well, I love Habermas and admire him greatly. And boy, when I'm 94, to produce a huge new book is what I want to be able to do. But, I think he's one of the greatest people in the world. But he did not quite understand what my own writing method was and why it was philosophical. But I think that good philosophy has to do, and I got that from the Greeks, by the way, from Plato, from, Greeks and the Romans, Plato, and from Seneca, from Cicero. So I think that, that's what I find the capabilities approach can do. It can start with people's actual life stories and build from that norms. Now, let me just say a word about how that book came about, which was that I came to this institute where I was working with Amartya Sen without knowing anything about other countries of the world. And here I was in this institute in Helsinki with people from lots of other countries, and I was completely ignorant of these other countries. And so I realized there's this whole world of human misery and discrimination, and the norms that are out there to deal with it are very crude. They're the norms either of just maximize economic growth norms, where economic growth is the best measure of how well a nation is doing, or they're the almost as crude norms of utilitarianism, where you measure quality of life by satisfaction of preferences. And of course, Sen had already put this in play, that the idea of asking people what they're actually able to do and to be was just not there. And by now, thank God, it is out there. It's one of the major development approaches. And furthermore, it's actually an international association. Anyone in this room can join the Human Development and Capability Association. I wish they would take human out of the title, but anyway, I've argued with people about that. Yeah. But anyway, there's a journal, there are annual meetings, and I guess we're 20 years old now. We just had our latest meeting in Sofia, Bulgaria, a wonderful meeting. So I think it's great that these ideas are the ideas of many people. A lot of disagreement in the association. I disagree with Sen. A lot of other people disagree. He disagrees with me, and other people disagree even more with me. And the whole project of animals and capabilities is very controversial in the association, because some people think, oh, we should care first solve all the human problems and only later get to the animals. So anyway, we have a lot of arguments and we work them out increasingly. And so I find that very exciting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now it's the turn of Professor Jesus Sanchez Garcia from the University of, from the Faculty of Geography and History. Please.
Thank you. Recalling the 2010 Príncipe de Asturias Award ceremony, you then began your speech affirming your fundamental interest as a philosopher in the development of an educational system strongly anchored in the crucial role of the humanities. In raising your voice against the neglect of the humanities, as you have addressed also in the book Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities, published in 2010, my question, actually two questions, specifically refers to the vindication of the arts and humanities education. Do you think that this has been a lack of criticism and action on the part of academics in the humanities field in the confrontation with an educational model oriented to technical skills and short-term economical profits? And the second one, what will be the best strategy for supporting education in humanities in a context of crisis like the ones we have suffered since 2008 in a global and vulnerable world, as the economic, pandemic, and climate crisis have shown?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Yes, I remember on that occasion also being so impressed that Felipe was a great advocate of the humanities, or at least his speechwriter was. But no, I mean, I talked to him privately also, and I think he really knew what he was talking about and was a very thoughtful person. So, you know, I think that, is there a lack of people writing about this, or is there a lack of media who are able to pick up what they're saying? I think that is part of the problem. Newspapers have declined. It's harder and harder for op-eds to get published. I have, at our law school, we work with a consultant who helps people place op-eds, and I've just gone through this. You know, newspapers are deluged with people's opinions, and they don't always want more support for the humanities and so forth. I was absolutely delighted that I got this piece of mine published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a very good place, which will be seen by a lot of people. But I think people are talking about it. It's a question of who's printing it and who's listening. Maybe there is a little bit of a lack in the sense that people just don't think they would know how to go about it. And so when I was chair of the Committee on Public Philosophy in the American Philosophical Association, we had workshops on how to write an op-ed, how to submit it to your local newspaper, things like that. And I hope whoever is on the committee now is doing the same thing. And of course, what they need to do now, which I don't do, is to use social media well. I am not on any social media. I don't want to be. It's just like a time waster for me, you know, but I know that it can be used well for these purposes. So I would just urge people who are on social media to use it for that purpose. So I do feel that there's a lack, but probably not so much a lack of the people, but the lack of how do they get their thoughts out into the public domain. I do think we need to advocate more consistently with the higher-ups in our own universities. In America, there's, of course, board of trustees of a private university, and they're the president and the provost. And I do believe that some of my faculty have been slow and not active enough in advocating for the humanities with those people. A good share of philosophy is very proactive and always advocating for philosophy, and ditto the other departments. And then there's the Board of Trustees, and there are all kinds of events that we have the option of going to, which involve donors coming to them. We have a humanities weekend in the fall where parents can come in. So concocting events that bring us into touch with, number one, the parents, which are very important constituents, and doing interesting panels that make that a weekend they would love to come to while they're visiting their kids and so forth. And then the trustees, where there can be an intermediary. Our humanities division has what's called a donors committee, and they do fundraising specifically for the humanities, and that's the head of it is a member of the Board of Trustees. So that with that kind of intermediary, we can have events like, so here's the following. This chair, who was a trustee, decided that there should be a donor event where we would read The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And I said to her, Randy, I'm not a Slavic scholar. Why can't I talk about Plato? And she was also asking an English professor, and he said, I'm an English professor, why can't I talk about Shakespeare? And we said, well, if it's going to be The Death of Ivan Ilyich, if you really want that, Randy, we have to get a third person who's a Slavic scholar. So we had the three of us teaching to the donors a class on the death of Ivan Ilyich. And it was fantastic. And I knew exactly why she wanted it, because all of those donors were exactly like Ivan Ilyich. They were people who were aging, and they never thought too much about the meaning of their life. And all these questions were aroused in them by thinking about their own death through that wonderful story. And then, of course, that leads up to the pitch. Well, if you want your life to be meaningful, donate to the philosophy department at the University of Chicago. So it was a brilliant insight of hers, and we need more people with those insights. So I think there are all kinds of things that we can do. And I'm afraid that my colleagues are somewhat reluctant to think in terms of gain. They don't want to dirty their hands by talking to people who have money and can give money. And that's ridiculous. They shouldn't do that at all. Because, well, for one thing, the head of our Board of Trustees happens to be a very powerful businessman, head of a private equity group, and he goes all around the world talking at Davos and other places about how wonderful the humanities are. Now, that happens to be his belief, but he got that from somewhere, and, he was educated at some point by some people. And so he gave one speech at Davos saying, instead of this acronym STEM, which, of course, you hear everywhere, he says, I propose H equals MC, humanities equals more cash. Well, because he says businesses need people who are imaginative and who can think. And this is what the humanities produce. Now, most of my colleagues would shrink back from that H equals MC because the cash seems dirty, But you got it. Any argument that leads to your conclusion, you should, unless there's evil in it, you should really follow it up and accept it. And so I really do believe that David Rubenstein is a wonderful gift to the humanities, because he goes all around the world saying, if you want your firm to do well, then study the humanities. So anyway, we should talk to everyone and not disdain the businessmen. Now, the best strategy to support education in the humanities, well, I've already said some things about that by what I said, but let me say something about the issues in my book, and let me point in particular to the fact that the book, Not-for-Profit, is coming out this fall in a new edition. It's going to have a new introduction by me. I don't think the Spanish edition will probably incorporate the new bits, but just look for it anyway. And it's in the series called Princeton Classics. Now, why is it Princeton Classics? Because it's actually been translated into 25 languages. It's, countries that I've never been to or know anything about have read it. So it struck a chord somehow, and for whatever reason, it is coming out in a new edition. And I think one thing that I have discovered in the years since I first wrote the book is that the countries that do well with the humanities, or relatively well, because everyone is under some threat, they tend to have at least parts of a liberal arts system of undergraduate education. Namely, you don't just go in to read one subject, but you have some general courses that link all students. There are elements of this in the Netherlands, in Finland, and so I've talked in all these places about these things, but it can't be like in Rotterdam, you have to pay extra to have that enriched humanities course, so that's no good. So you have to have equal access to this. And the place that I think is closest, well, the US definitely has this. This is our system. But there's also South Korea that has tremendous liberal arts education. When I toured around talking about the humanities there, I was very, very impressed with what they're doing. And I think it has all the result that you would expect, namely a very thriving culture of democratic debate and protest and so on. So anyway, I think studying those examples, thinking about the great Jesuit universities, because they all have a liberal arts model in some respect. So in Latin America, you would find the tremendous humanities education in the Jesuit universities. So I think just studying examples and thinking from where you are, how you could better incorporate humanities, not as a specialty that is for majors only, but as an element of education for all students. Because for all students, it offers these benefits, 3 benefits: the David Rubenstein benefit, that you're more attractive to business and because you know how to think and you know how to imagine. But then the advantage of you know how to conduct political debate in a decent, respectful, and rational way, what we talked about a while ago. But finally, the advantage of being able to look into yourself and think about things that enrich your whole life and that prepare you for what's ahead in your whole life. Because adult education in America that's where the humanities are a real growth industry. When people retire, if they retire at the age of 65, you don't have to, thank God, but when people do, they go and take humanities courses because they've made money all their life, but they don't know what it all means. So, but if they could get to that earlier and then be reading from time to time, all the way along, things that make life meaningful to them, this is a tremendous advantage in life. If you have a rich inner world with many voices kicking around in there, the voices of Plato or Tolstoy or whatever. And so I do feel that's, who cares which is most important, but it's one of the most important things that people get out of it. And that's for everyone. It's not just for philosophy majors. So how can the universities of most of the world, which have a single subject model, more and more transition to a liberal arts model? That's what I would urge people to ask. Okay. Well, you asked about global and vulnerable worlds, so let me add something about that. Yeah, I mean, I think this is another thing that makes the liberal arts model so appealing, because you could, in a liberal arts program like ours, you can construct a course in pandemics and fear, or whatever you want to do, team taught by a science person and a person from the humanities. A flexible curriculum where there is general education on offer for all, because otherwise people are too siloed and they don't really, the climate change will be taught one way in the science department and a completely different way in the philosophy department. Yeah.
Okay, now it's the turn of Professor Pedro López Barja from the Faculty of Geography and History.
Muchas gracias, señor decano, por esta invitación. A ver si me aclaro. Bueno, my questions revolve all around the Greeks. Your book, Professor Nussbaum, has given me several hours of pleasure, of the kind of pleasure that Plato valued most, namely intellectual pleasure. And so I want to ask you about what was the impulse, so to speak? What drove you to the Greeks? What was the main or the first idea that led you to ancient Greek philosophy? And also, I am curious about the title of the book, about if the fragility of goodness was somehow inspired or related to this well-known phrase by Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil. Is there any connection between both? Is the title of your book somehow wants to refer to this well-known phrase by Hannah Arendt? And also, I would like to ask you about this very modern trend. We now live in a sort of expansion of Stoicism, a version, a very diluted, a very distorted version of Stoicism, which is now in the media, even in social, in TikTok or Twitter. No, many quite unexpected people declare themselves as Stoics. No? What would you say are the reasons for this expansion, no? For all these people declaring themselves as Stoics? And lastly, a very specific point about something that you said in The Fragility of Goodness, because you established a sort of opposition between Plato and Aristotle in related to women. No? You said there that precisely because Plato suppressed or eliminated family from his utopia, from his Gallipoli, he was able to give ample room to women in the public sphere. And Aristotle, and I know that you love him very much, but Aristotle did just the reverse. No, he put family in the center, and accordingly, he had to deny the place, a place in the public sphere for women. No? So, thank you.
Four amazing questions. Let me start with the banality of evil, because there's an easy answer to that. First, the answer is I had not read that book when I wrote The Fragility of Goodness, it wasn't published in 1986, but I began writing it in about 1978 or something. Anyway, I hadn't read the book. But the second thing is it's actually a very different problem, because The Fragility of Goodness is a nice sounding title, but it's a little bit misleading because it suggests that it's about the mutability of good character. And that one chapter touches on that, the chapter on the Hecuba. But it's mostly about the obstacles we encounter in our pursuit of the good life. So we're living a good life and we are good people, but then suddenly something intervenes, a war or a death of a loved one, that sends our search for the good life askew. And that's what I was writing about. So, for example, in French, it ought to be fragilité du bien humain, not de la bonté. And so, you know, fragility, I couldn't have said fragility of the human good. That would be a clunky title. But it is misleading in that way. And, of course, Arendt is talking entirely about the inner character of a person being eroded. Okay, so the second one, what led me to Greek ethics, Roman ethics too, I hasten to say. The first thing is to say I was an actress for a long time, and I actually was a professional actress. I left undergraduate school after a year and a half to take a job acting in a repertory theater that did Greek drama, and it was exciting to me, and I acted with Judith Anderson playing Clytemnestra, Ruby Dee, the great black actress, playing Cassandra, and I was in the chorus, but the chorus was choreographed by one of Martha Graham's leading dancers. So it was very exciting. But it was long before that I was led to this, because I was in a very good women's school, and when I was 12 years old, the teacher asked several of us we were studying ancient Greece, several of us to read the actual plays and write term papers on that. And I actually didn't write about the tragedies. I wrote about Aristophanes, whom I continue to love, and I think he's a marvelous playwright. And I didn't even have access to the accurate translations, which came out only later, because it was all very boulderized and excised. But I still loved Aristophanes. Anyway, it just led me to the Greeks and to Greek drama. And in my interest in theater in high school, I was already acting out scenes from Greek tragedy. So I felt there was something of deep importance in those works. And I experienced it, I guess, first in my body as an actress, and then began to think about it afterwards. And so much later, when I went on to graduate school and so forth, my aim was to think about the philosophical significance of Greek drama. But when I got to Harvard, I found that there were two sorts of people teaching Greek drama. One sort were the philologists, who were very, very good. And I could learn a lot from them, but they weren't interested in the ideas. They were editing the texts. And the other sort were writing a kind of literary criticism that was superficial and not very helpful, I thought. So I just didn't know where to go. And so as it happened, that was when I wrote the Heraclitus paper. So in my despair about doing what I really wanted to do, and that is writing about the ideas in Greek drama, I went over to the philosophy department and studied with Will Owen, and he was doing this seminar on the pre-Socratics. And so I went on, and I followed him and worked on the pre-Socratics and then on Aristotle. But I still wanted to do this about Greek ethics. And when I would ask Owen, what am I going to do about this? He said, well, you have to find yourself a supervisor in the classics. No, there wasn't one there. That was the problem, exactly the problem. And I always knew that it was the rigor and depth of philosophy that I wanted in this problem. And then Bernard Williams turned up at Harvard, and I found somebody who understood what I really wanted to do and who helped me do it. And so at the same time as I was writing my dissertation on Aristotle with Owen, I started working on what later became The Fragility of Goodness under the supervision of Bernard Williams, a philosopher that I immensely revere and who died quite prematurely because of bad health care in Britain and so forth. Anyway, he told me that this is a really important philosophical topic. You should pursue it. Here are some things you can think about if you pursue it. And he was himself writing Moral Luck at the time. And so I would bring little drafts of bits of The Fragility of Goodness to talk to with him while I was showing Owen bits of the other. And then, gradually started writing the book itself. It was very controversial. Everyone in the sub-profession ganged up on me and said this is a book that shouldn't exist and you shouldn't get tenure. And I didn't get tenure because that was the book I was writing. Because it talked about literature alongside philosophy. It brought literature together with philosophy. But gradually, I won the battle. And at the 20th anniversary of Fragility of Goodness, we did a symposium at the APA where I looked back on it and I said, well, here we are. And I really won that battle. And the whole idea of mingling the study of philosophy with deep study of literary works, luckily, I got enough encouragement early enough from the powerful men in the field, because that's all there was men. Williams first, and then we had Stanley Cavell, with whom I taught these things at Harvard, and he, of course, did the same thing himself with Shakespeare. And then Hilary Putnam, of all people, a great philosopher, but just curious and interested in everything. And then when I was invited to give a paper, a kind of invited lecture at a philosophical association meeting in my second year as an assistant professor, I said to myself, well, I'm going to take the plunge and not do something on Aristotle because that's what everyone expects me to do. I'm going to do something on literature. Well, it happened that I was teaching this course on philosophy and the novel, so the paper I gave was Henry James, so it wasn't Greek tragedy, but it was the same problem. I mean, bringing philosophers kicking and screaming to look at a work of literature for philosophical insight. And luckily, my commentator at that session was the great Richard Wollheim, the great British aesthetician. And he, too, encouraged me and said, well, we've got to publish our exchange in a journal. What journal should it be? And Ralph Cohen, this wonderful editor at New Literary History, who died only a couple of years ago, long after the age of 100. Anyway, Ralph said, well, better publish it. And Hilary Putnam contributed a paper, Cora Diamond contributed a paper. So anyway, that whole sub-profession was up and running, and I was so glad that I stuck with this topic and I had not been deterred. If I had just gone on writing on Aristotle's De Motu, I mean, I've been told this by people, if you'd written a second book like your first book, you would have gotten tenure. Blah, blah. Well, but I wouldn't have done work that was so exciting to me, but not just to me, but it opened up a whole field for other people, which I think has been very fertile, and it leads to more and more study of great writers of many kinds, such as Proust, of course, is one of them. So that, I think, is part of an answer to your great question. Now, the Stoic question. Yeah, it's so funny. The Stoics, of course, wrote for public servants, and that's who they wrote for. They knew how to do it. And so Epictetus and Seneca have always been popular in different periods with different kinds of people. And I remember a period when Admiral Stockdale, who was talking, he was strange. He was the candidate for vice president when Ross Perot ran for president. You probably don't remember this strange episode in American politics. Anyway, he was a former vice admiral, and during the Vietnam War, he had been a prisoner of war, and he had kept his men sane by reading to them from Epictetus and talking to them about the views of Stoicism that he found in Epictetus. Think about what you control and what you don't control. Realize that under torture you will give up secrets, but there's still something in you that you do control. So anyway, he wrote a book about this, and you can look it up, Stockdale. I can't remember the title, but anyway, how he kept his men sane through the Stoics. And I think that's a very honorable use of the Stoics. It's exactly what they were about. It was about how to deal with horrible times in your own society and yet remain a person of integrity who has an inner self. Now what's happening is it's chic among rich people. In America, it's mostly Silicon Valley, and people who are, rich yuppies in Silicon Valley think they're Stoic. I don't think they have any idea what it's about, actually. So my friend Nancy Sherman at Georgetown wrote an excellent book called Stoic Wisdom, debunking some of the false Stoicisms that are out there and giving a very good account of what in Stoicism is really worth talking about. Now, Nancy has the great merit of having taught for several years at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, where Stoic attitudes towards life are in some way imbibed with the culture because you have to get on top of your fear and so on. But she knows what's useful and what's not useful in it. She talks about Stoic attitudes toward resilience rather than just apathy. So anyway, I think she makes an excellent account of what's really worth attending to in Stoicism, and I really recommend that book. So I think every time will have its own fans of Stoicism, and some are more true fans than others, I guess.
Okay, before we pass to the questions of the audience, let me refer to the question that my colleague Oscar Horta sent to me. Is regarding your last book on justice for animals. Why do you think your capabilities approach allows us for an appropriate defense of animal rights, animal ethics? Given that many of the people here could not attend the ceremony of this morning, maybe you can give us a brief summary of your main ideas on this.
Oh, boy. That's the whole book, right? Look, what I do, the strategy in the book is to pick 3 prominent philosophical approaches to animal ethics and say why I believe each of them has defects, some greater than others, and then try to say after that why my version of the capabilities approach remedies those defects and goes beyond them. So the first approach, which is very prominent in litigation in America on behalf of animals, is the one that I call the so like us approach, which says, well, animals are to be valued in accordance with their likeness to human beings. It uses the whole idea of the scala naturae, which, by the way, Aristotle did not invent. I've just written a new Aristotle paper. I rarely write an Aristotle paper these days, but in memory of my friend, the great Finnish Aristotelian Simo Knutila, I did write such a paper, and it's going to come out in this memorial volume. But anyway, I wrote about the De Motu Animalium yet one more time, and tried to say why he does not permit such an idea as the scala naturae. But anyway, why should we think that there's this ladder and some are better than others? Better in what respect? When we actually look at animals in nature, we find tremendous difference. And each animal has the skills that are suited to its own evolution and its ecological niche. Some animals, like birds, have senses that we don't have. They can perceive magnetic fields. Dolphins can find what's inside an object they approach by echolocation, and so forth. So it just makes no sense to arrange animals all on a single scale. And of course, in terms of things that are always mentioned, like language and reason and so on, animals have their own ways of communicating, and often extremely syntactically complex, often involving very complicated systems. It's just that we sometimes don't understand them and often can't even hear them. Like elephant language is only just beginning to be understood because it's too low in frequency to be heard by human ears. Whale have the same problem, so they have to record it first and then translate it into a frequency that humans can actually hear. So anyway, we're just at the very beginning of understanding about animal communication systems, but it makes no sense to say that there aren't any. And so anyway, there are many things to say against the scala naturae. But the main problem in animal ethics is a lot of the most awful abuses are perpetrated on animals that are not at all similar to humans in the factory farming industry, but are worthy of concern and regard and respect anyway for what they are. And you should think about what it does for them, not what it does for us and our pride in our own species. So yes, I mean, back to the question about pride, I do believe that there is pride involved in our thinking that we're above all nature and that no other species is real. I did not answer that part of the great question on that topic. So, it's just a bad approach, I think. But he chose it, this lawyer, because he thinks most judges are thinking in that way. And that if he can get judges to give some person-like rights to apes and maybe elephants, then that's the first step in a process that will lead to better treatment of other animals. I don't think he's right. I think if you begin with a bad tool, then you're going to go down the wrong road all the way. But I'm happy to cooperate with him. So now when Steve Wise is bringing a case on elephants, he's doing it increasingly for elephants in zoos, I submit an amicus brief that gives my own view of why that elephant should be freed, and they can buy that. And the Colorado Supreme Court just said in their opinion that they cited my book as saying that elephants ought to be treated with the dignity proper to their species. So, I think his approach is the wrong one, but it can sometimes cooperate with the right one. Then there's the utilitarian approach, which, of course, wonderful work has been produced by Bentham, by John Stuart Mill, and most recently by Peter Singer, focusing on pain, which, of course, is a main thing in our bad treatment of animals. But the problem is that it flattens the world too much. It makes us think pain is the only bad thing, pleasure is the only good thing. Now, Mill's version doesn't do that. And I think, I'm a great lover of Mill, and I think that if you put Mill and me together, you would find very few differences, because he does allow for qualitative distinctions. So in the book, I go into all of that. But the sort of card-carrying utilitarians like Bentham and Singer will not say that. They go with pain being a single thing, pleasure being a single thing. So we now have the problem that there are other things in an animal life which could be lacking while they don't have any pain, such as they might be brought up in a humane zoo that doesn't inflict pain, but doesn't allow them 200 miles to walk, as an elephant usually does. Now, they don't know they're missing anything because they don't feel any pain, but they are. They're missing a kind of behavior that's a part of the life of their species that would enrich their life if they did know it. And then what about social things? If a dolphin is treated humanely in water theme park, probably it can bond with humans and so, but dolphin social life is usually in a pod of 35 to 40 dolphins. And it's really not, you know, the dolphin might not know that if it's never seen it, but its life is deprived. So that's my idea, that there can be things that can be lacking without pain, particularly social bonds and particularly forms of activity that the creature in a zoo might not know. So I think Singer and I are allies up to a point. Again, you know, we can certainly say all the same things about the factory farming industry, but we differ in that way. I then talk about Christine Korsgaard's Kantian approach in the wonderful book, Fellow Creatures. I think this is one of the best philosophical books, and I'm so glad that she wrote her dissertation with me on Aristotle and Kant, and I think the parts that are inspired by Aristotle about animals pursuing their own goals are excellent. But when she, you know, tenaciously, because she loves Kant so much, she says, well, animals can only be passive citizens because they don't have the deliberative abilities that's characteristic of a mature Kantian person. Well, the point is animals can register their preferences, so they can certainly be very active citizens. If, for example, we in politics have offices and ministries that are dedicated to noticing what's going on with animals. I mean, think about how in any city you have a Department of Child and Family Services or the like that's dedicated to uncovering child abuse. Well, of course, the child is not exercising Kantian deliberative abilities, but it's in the care of the state, which does exercise those abilities on behalf of those children. And even children who never in their life, children with intellectual disabilities, will have the Kantian abilities, still can be citizens and participate in the political process. So animals, too, can participate in just such a way through a guardian who would then hire a lawyer. So that's basically what I say to Chris, and I think we have a lot in common, but just not that one thing. And then I go on to say a lot more. So I have a chapter on what sentience is, how do we find it, how do we do experiments figuring out what kinds of species have sentience, because I do think that the truth in utilitarianism is that there's a kind of line, that there are some creatures who are worthy of our ethical concern who might not be subjects of justice because they don't have a striving for a form of life that's being wrongly thwarted. And I think that's true of plants, and I also think that's true of probably some animals, the one that Aristotle called the stationary animals, like sea cucumbers, anemones, and so sponges, and maybe some insects. So this is unclear. Research still is out. The jury is out on that one. But anyway, that's what I do in that chapter. Then I look at what is the harm of death? Because I think when we talk about eating animals, we have to ask that question. Is death bad? And if it is, how is it bad? And when is it bad? And that's an old Greek philosophical question, which I've often been fascinated by in Epicurus and Lucretius. So I talk about that, and I argue, which I'm sure is controversial, that the bad of death is the interruption of a being's activities that involve temporally extended activity, okay? So if you did everything in the moment, and you were just cut short at an instant, then you wouldn't, according to me, you wouldn't be harmed by that death. So I apply that, and I said that I think, up till now, I believe that certainly most animals can be interrupted, in my sense. And not so Jeff McMahon, for example, and other utilitarians have thought that all animals live in the moment, and that's definitely false. They all have temporally extended projects. But I think that it's probably the case that fish do not, and that fish, therefore, if allowed to range freely and then killed in a genuinely painless manner, it might be okay to eat those fish. And actually, R.M. Hare, the British utilitarian, wrote an article long ago called Why I Am Only a Demi-Vegetarian, and he took that line, and Peter Singer at that time said that he agreed with Hare, but the reason he didn't actually eat fish was that he was a public figure and he'd be misunderstood. So anyway, that's what's in that chapter. I then look at various tragic dilemmas, going back to Greek tragedy, between two goods and that pit the good of animals against other goods for both animals and people, like medical experimentation. And so I try to think about those tragic dilemmas. I won't go on long. Then there's a specific chapter on companion animals that raise special problems. And then a chapter on wild animals that also raise special problems. And finally, a chapter on friendship between human and an animal, which I think is a great good, but I think it has much more exacting terms than many people think. I think it requires genuine reciprocity and mutuality, and it requires being in the same place. So, I mean, it's kind of easy to see how it could be possible with companion animals. Could there be friendship between human beings and wild animals? Well, I look at a few cases where it does seem to me those conditions are realized, but there are special conditions where the people are researchers and so forth. So anyway, that's what I do. And then finally, I get to law. And here, of course, I can't treat the whole convoluted situation that we're in, but I look at examples from local ordinances, national ordinances, and here I'm focusing on the US, but of course I give some information about why Europe is better in many respects. And then I get to international law, which, you know, I mean, outside of the border waters of the US, marine mammals and many other creatures have to depend entirely on this totally weak and toothless system of international treaty law, and I talk about that problem. So that's what the book contains, and of course, I'm very happy to extend it further in different ways, and I've written these 2 pieces more on whales in the New York Review of Books, and I'm planning to write another book about, well, I won't say what it will be since I haven't written it yet, but anyway, so I'm continuing to refine this and extend it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this wonderful answer. And now I invite the audience to make comments and questions to Professor Nussbaum. We have about 25 minutes or so. Professor Marcelino Gis, please. Do we have a microphone for him? Yeah. Okay, here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me some words in English just to say thank you for coming to Santiago de Compostela. Thank you for coming our university and our Faculty of Philosophy. As you know, I was the dean when began the process. Today is a wonderful day for me, for everyone here. I thank you also, Professor Martín González. His laudatio this morning was very interesting. And last but not least, thank you very much, Professor Xavier De Donato. He is now the Dean of the Faculty. And so for us, also because I teach history of contemporary philosophy and hermeneutics, for me and for my students, it's very important you visit in Santiago de Compostela. So next time I promise show you the university or even the cathedral. And so Professor Nussbaum, please come back to Santiago de Compostela.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for your role in this whole process. And thank you all. I want to thank you for your role in the whole process, and thanks to you for carrying it through and organizing this wonderful event. Yes, I've loved my brief visit, and I will certainly try to come back at some point and see the cathedral and other things, and it's really been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. More questions, please. Jorge. Jorge Sacido.
Okay. Well, thank you very much and good afternoon. Congratulations on your honorary doctorate. We're very glad and honored to have you here. I hope you'll have few years ahead of you and write thick books like Jürgen Habermas, but I like yours much more, if I may say. Well, my question perhaps is a stupid one or a tricky one, and it has to do, to put it very shortly, what is the socio-political status of children? What I mean by this is, well, you referred to before, earlier on, in passing, that you are not an expert, or children are not your concern from an academic, scientific point of view. And you referred to the issue of aging, and likewise, you also, I think, yeah, you referred to the Senectute by Cicero.
Yeah.
I was remembering that, but of course you referred to old age. And when I read your human development, women's development book, I came across a statement that read something like children's function are very important for the acquisition of mature adult capabilities. And you also pointed out that capabilities are the most important, the proper, I think you said the proper political and ethico-political goal. So if I'm not mistaken, you distinguish between what you call functioning, right?
Yeah.
And capability.
Yeah.
What I want to know is just the distinction between those two concepts, because they are very much alike, they overlap, and they seem to be the same, but they are not the same. I'm sure you have the...
No, I mean, capability is a substantive opportunity for choice, but the choice has to be made by the person. And so the reason that children are special is that I think for children, and only for children, it's possible to require certain functions at a certain age in order to produce adult capabilities, freedom of choice, such as compulsory education. I think you're just not going to get children to educate themselves, and quite a lot about the content of what should be in the education. Having read a lot in the history of progressive education, people like, I don't know if you know Neil's book, Summerhill, the great progressive school, you know, by telling children to make up their own classes and telling themselves what they want to learn, those children didn't get the most out of themselves, and I'm afraid that's true. I taught for many happy years at Brown University, where the initial policy, for similar reasons, had been that there were no required courses, just a certain number of courses, but they could be any courses at all, and you could take them all pass-fail with no grade. Well, gradually that eroded because people who wanted to get into graduate school needed a grade, and so by the time I got there, it was weaker. But what I noticed still was that the people who signed up pass-fail, the system was the professor didn't know who in the class was taking it pass-fail until the end when you saw the grade. And then you saw that it was all the ones to whom you would have given a C. You know, so I think people just need the motivation. At a certain age, they need the motivational strength of a requirement if they're really going to get the most out of themselves. When they're adults, then they have to get it out of themselves. And I am much more libertarian about adults in all matters, healthcare and everything. But I do think, and again, children, there should be strict requirements about how children's health is attended to. And if the parents are Jehovah's Witnesses and don't want them to have certain blood transfusions, can't be allowed to do that. You have to give the child what it needs, and you can't even ask the child because it's under the parent's domination. So that's the difference between children and adults. I do think that U.S. law has gone much too far in this protectionist direction in the following way. We raised the voting, so the voting age was 21. It was lowered to 18 during the Vietnam War because the reasoning was quite correct that people who can die in a war ought to be able to vote about it. But the drinking age had been 18 and it was raised to 21. And it's still illegal to drink until 21. This is a disaster because, of course, undergraduates will drink, and they will just get false IDs, or they will get somebody who's 21 to buy the stuff. And the adults can't supervise the parties because they will be arrested if they do for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. So every university administrator I know would like the drinking age to be lowered, but it's just false Puritanism and protectionism and so forth. So I think, 18 is probably the cutoff for reasonable maturity to be expected of people. Maybe not in whether they have to take the required philosophy class or something, but anyway, that's just for the university to decide. But I think otherwise, children are future adults, and they therefore should be prepared to have all the rights of adults. So more and more choice as time goes on, more and more discussion of the choices they're later going to have when they actually register to vote and so on.
More questions?
Bueno, se podía hablar en español, ¿no? Para preguntar. En el último libro de Justicia para los Animales hablas mucho de... Hablas mucho de las vidas de los animales que tienen que ser... Ah, vale.
Okay.
Vale, en el último libro que publicaste de Justicia para los Animales, habla de que debemos defender las vidas de los animales porque pueden ser florecientes y que deben desarrollarse como tal. Mi pregunta era para las especies invasoras que integramos en otros entornos y que acaban acabando con vidas de animales que al final se pueden desarrollar. ¿Cuál sería tu postura en cuanto a lo que deberíamos hacer con este tipo de especies? Porque al final siguen siendo animales y siguen pudiendo desarrollar una vida floreciente y los problemas están causados por culpa nuestra.
Yeah, that is really a great question. Now, my principle always includes a self-defense exception, and it's defense of self or of others, including other animals. So I can get away with saying we can kill these invasive species if I wanted to, but I think with all of these self-defense principles, you retreat first, you use as little force as you can get away with. So, I mean, just to take a simple case, what about rats? Now, they're a clear threat to the health and safety of humans and other animals, but it's probably not the first step to poison all the rats. Number one, it actually leaves poison around for other animals to eat. And when animals eat, like an eagle in my city recently ate a poisoned rat and then died. And so that has downstream effects that are bad. But also, there are other ways of doing it that are more humane, such as using contraception. And there is great progress in animal contraception. So I think with the invasive species, of course, it depends what they are, but there are other... Think of what other imaginative methods, short of killing, could be explored and used. Now, of course, sometimes you're under pressure of time. In the Great Lakes, there's this fish, the Asian carp, and they've tried to put up barriers that have electric shock, which to me is a good idea to, deter them rather than just killing them all. And once they get in, you're never going to kill them all anyway. But I think using things like that, kind of physical barrier, or contraception, if you can do it, which is often very effective, especially with insects, is the first avenue that should be tried. The lethal methods with invasive species are usually difficult and not very successful anyway. But I do think that's the way you should think about it, as a form of defense of others.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Hay una pregunta al fondo.
Hola. ¿Puedo hablar ya?
Well, I think...
¿Puedo hablar ya?
Sí.
Vale. Yo en relación con lo que dijo mi compañero, yo hice un trabajo sobre esto, un trabajo para Óscar Horta sobre la consideración moral de los animales, y además de esto que dice, yo justamente en el trabajo defendí con este mismo ejemplo el caso de las especies invasoras, y también introduje sobre el tema de la sintiencia, introduje una cuestión importante que a mí me pareció, al menos interesante introducirla y mencionarla, Y te quería preguntar acerca de si esta cuestión pues quizás puede ser más correcta o menos. Y bueno, y preguntarte acerca de qué opinas tú acerca de esta validez. Yo parto de la base también un poco de considerar, bueno, lo que yo añadí en esa tesis era la base de que, aparte de la sintiencia, también era interesante considerar no solo la capacidad de sentir de los animales, sino la capacidad del bien y el mal que pueden estos hacer al resto del mundo. Y si esto realmente es un criterio importante para considerar, pues eso, la vida de los animales o la importancia que tienen distintas especies.
Well, you know, yes, in a way, but I don't think we should rank species in terms of giving more care to those that seem to do more good. I think that's just another form of the scala naturae. I think, you know, in thinking about, I would rather focus on the narrow exception to my general no harm principle for self-defense and defense of others. I think that's much less, much more clear and crisp than getting into the murky waters of, oh, how does a species help or harm others? We all don't know our effects, and we help and harm one another in many ways. And just as I think it would be very wrong to have a ranking of human beings in terms of how much one helps or harms others, how can you even calculate that? So too with animals. So I do feel that with all of these, if you can't find a way out of some really terrible dilemma, like you're going to have to allow one species to die in order for another one to live, it has the form of a Greek tragedy. And so then my chapter on tragic dilemmas says when you have such a tragedy, if it is a genuine one, and everything you do is going to be doing some wrong, then the thing to do is to try to imagine a far distant, perhaps, but still conceivable future where that conflict would be eliminated. What would it take us to get there? And in the case of medical experimentation, I think we know already computer simulation would do away, if we developed it well enough, with the need for experimentation. So that's the way I would prefer to think of these things, rather than the whole totaling up of the harm and the good that people do.
Okay, we have time for one or two questions more. One question there.
I think just one more, maybe.
Just one more. The last one, then.
So, hi. I've been reading your books, and I have to say that I really like the way you write. And I'm writing a paper for class, and I was wondering if you could help me a little bit. So, what role does anger play in promoting social justice?
Could you speak a little louder? I can't quite hear you.
Oh, okay. So, I'm writing a paper for class, and I was wondering if you could help me. So, what role does anger play in promoting social justice? That's it.
What book? What about social justice?
Yes.
Sex and Social Justice, that's the book you're reading?
What role does anger?
Oh, what role does anger play?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I have a very controversial position about this, but my idea is that ordinary anger, where you really just want to get back at somebody, strike back, that plays a purely negative role in social justice. I think that it's actually damaging in many respects, and that I believe law should not be based on that kind of retributive, backward-looking anger. Now, there's one form of anger, however, that I think does not have that failure. I give it a technical term called transition anger, because it's pointed, you make a transition and you think of the future rather than striking back. And I give it a technical term because most ordinary words like indignation or righteous anger are used in both ways. So I want to be very clear. And the kind of anger that I think is productive of justice is this one, and its whole content is, that was outrageous, it should not happen again. Now, that doesn't mean you wouldn't use punishment. You might, in order to deter people from doing that thing again, or to teach people or educate them, to express your values in society. But that's the kind of anger that a protest movement, for example, I think should use. That King's movement, I exemplify this quite a lot in the anger book by talking about Mandela and King, who were both non-retributivists. They didn't want to demonize or brutalize the people that had harmed them. They wanted to get on with life and make things better. And they used whatever strategies would produce that result, which would often not be to strike back. But in fact, Mandela always had to discourage his own followers from striking back, often in violent ways, against white South Africans, because we want to build a country together. We want to stop the abuses from occurring in the future, rather than to, constantly deal with the past. So anyway, that's what I say in Anger and Forgiveness, and I extensively discuss King. I look at the particular, the famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, to show how he draws an emotion map for the audience from their outrage to a future hope, future constructed by hope, faith, and love. And that's difficult. It's much more difficult to love your enemy than it is to strike back and kill your enemy. But this is what King was asking people to do. And so this is what the approach that I favor. Now, I also recently wrote, I've written a book recently about Benjamin Britten's work called The War Requiem, a great musical work about war and peace, which deals with anger a lot. And Britten was a pacifist, and he was not just a political pacifist, but he was what I would call an emotional pacifist, who did believe that anger did great damage. And so I find this in the music. So what I did is write a spin-off paper from that to talk about the kinds of pacifism in their relation to, I gave it in Bulgaria recently, the current war in Russia and Ukraine and so on. And to say that I think the kind of pacifism that says always be a conscientious objector, to me is not very useful, because there are occasions where in defense of your country or other people, you must use violence, however bad it would be to do that. And I think the Ukraine war is such a case, actually. But I do think that the emotional pacifist, there's always room for emotional pacifism, which is to say, don't be a retributivist, don't demonize or hate the other side. Do whatever you do in order to create a better future where people can live together in peace, whatever that might possibly be in the present situation. So anyway, you'll see the book when it comes out in the fall. But the spin-off paper is coming out in a Bulgarian journal of social science, but it's coming out in English. And the person to ask is Petya Ilieva, who's the chair of the sociology faculty there. But anyway, emotional pacifism is what I call it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in the name of my colleagues here in the round table and in the name of the Faculty of Philosophy, I can only show my gratitude, a lot of gratitude to Professor Nussbaum for having accepted to be here with us. And well, thank you very much.
Well, let me first of all, thank you again for organizing this, because I had a most wonderful time, and thank all of you for your wonderful questions, which were so fun to think about. And I was on the plane and jotting down notes about what I might say. So thank you so much, and thanks to the audience for your great questions too. And I've had a most wonderful visit here, and it's been a great honor and pleasure for me.